Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Blake, and on behalf of my output team, comprised of Anna and Tunishka, wherever she is, we would like to welcome you to the final briefing for HR 806, the Clean Energy and Sustainability Accelerator Act. First, I would like to take a moment and thank Dr. Cohen for all your great support and guidance, and also the remaining team. Without this, none of this would be possible. Without their help, none of this would be possible. So for today's agenda, we'll be going through the Accelerator overview. We'll be looking at why the bill is addressing reducing emissions. We'll look at the reduction strategy. We'll talk about guidelines and success measures for the bill, and then finally some next steps. So first, what is HR 806? So this bill establishes the Clean Energy Accelerator, which allocates $100 billion through the length of its charter into clean technology. And it does this through a variety of mechanisms noted here. And I'll touch on these in a little bit, but the one thing, if there's anything I can ask you guys to take away from this, is that the purpose of this bill is to increase investments into clean technology in order to reduce emissions. But why exactly do we care about reducing emissions? Well, emissions are the byproduct of combustion, and through this process, it releases CO2, which is a component of the emissions. And CO2, everyone's favorite molecule, is at an all-time high here. You can kind of see it on the graph. But we're looking at CO2 levels currently in the atmosphere that have not been noted for the past 800 million years. I mean, it's kind of incredible when you think about it. And what this leads to is a kind of an exacerbated greenhouse effect, right? So it speeds up the process of global warming. In addition, emissions also create human health risks and lead to biodiversity loss. Human health risks like increased bronchitis rates and asthma levels, which are respiratory illnesses, and also through processes like ocean acidification, that leads to the biodiversity loss that I just noted. But who exactly emits, right? And the sad part is, well, nearly every sector of our economy emits, right? With transportation leading the way at 29%, electricity following it at 25%, and industrial, residential, commercial, and agriculture. So when you look at this, the obvious question is, well, transportation is 29%. Why are we focused on clean energy? And the reason is, the way we generate our electricity, the technology we use in that sector can be impacted and applied to all other sectors. Furthermore, as it stands today, unfortunately, regardless of economic assumptions, both high and lowish, we see that these two lines here, the two solid lines, emissions from the electricity sector are expected to increase, which is the complete opposite of the direction we need them to go. In addition, demand for electricity is only increasing. So this sector sits at a really interesting crossroads, right? And the way we invest our capital can decide whether or not electricity is harmful or helpful. But exactly how will the bill allocate these funds? So it does this through three mechanisms. First, it finances clean technology through direct federal investments. It also provides zero interest loans to municipalities or other organizations that are seeking to have a zero emission fleet or bolster their zero emission fleet infrastructure. It also helps mobilize private capital through public education. So the idea is by public outreach, they would stimulate demand for these products, thereby increasing, the reasons for investors to get involved. And then also through this, these private investors can target underfunded technologies. It would also create green banks, which are local entities that work on the ground close to where the projects are being deployed, partners with the federal government, and can provide fixed funding to these projects. But what kind of projects would they be investing in? So first are, there's kind of three buckets to look at: how we generate our energy, what we do with that energy, and how we, move it throughout the country, and then also carbon negative technology or carbon sequestration. So first, wind, solar, and geothermal create the renewable energy supply base. So these are the three kind of key technologies that we would want to invest in. Wind obviously generates wind force into electricity. Solar turns sunlight into electricity, And geothermal takes heat from the Earth's mantle and converts it into electricity and actually heats your home directly. But once you generate this, or how you generate this, can vary depending on where you are in the US. And there's a couple of different ways to generate power. First is a centralized methodology. And this is massive energy generation done in a single site and then distributed to end users. Think of nuclear power plants, hydroelectric dams, et cetera, et cetera. Or the complete opposite is what's known as a distributed. This is small scale energy generation done close to end users. Home solar, for instance, is probably the best example. And when you look at this, you're like, whoa, that's fantastic. Let's just deploy a bunch of distributed energy grids, call it a day, and we can all go home, right? The problem is renewable energy is inherently variable depending on where you are in the US. So you need a way to balance this. And that's where high voltage power lines come into play, another technology that needs to be invested in. These function as the methods to balance and distribute energies from just both centralized and distributed energy sources throughout the US. However, there's current regulatory complications. I think it's like 200 different agencies are currently involved in trying to get these power lines installed, and public acceptance is not where it needs to be. This is where the Clean Energy Accelerator can help. But once this power is generated and distributed, you then need a way to store it just in case things go south, right? The sun stops shining. Actually, that would be really bad. The wind stops blowing, right? And this is where batteries come into play. They go, you can use them as part of the energy grid. You can put them in your electric vehicles, et cetera. But in terms of where we are today, their lifespan is only 2 to 10 years, and they only supply power for 4 to 6 hours. And if you're trying to power New York City and only have 6 hours, that's not that long, right? So we got to bolster these numbers here. But then at the same time, you have to invest in what's known as carbon negative technology or carbon sequestration. So there's 3 main types: carbon capture and storage, biochar, direct air capture, et cetera. But the primary function, regardless of the type, is to capture CO2 emissions, either right at the source or after they've been emitted. However, this technology is extremely energy and capital intensive, and also there's very limited market incentives to keep the carbon stored. So we need to create ways to incentivize storing carbon and not putting it back into products. But then, because all this technology that I just mentioned, it's very different, right? So the bill also establishes some guidelines to consider for all types of investments. So while it creates green banks, finances clean technology, mobilizes private capital, et cetera, it sets a few guidelines. One is ecological integrity. So every project must consider the ecological integrity of the site in which it's being deployed. The bill earmarks 40% of the $100 billion for low-income communities of color. It also, every project must deploy fair labor practices, so it has to pay a prevailing wage and also employ a certain number of union workers. And finally, every project must illustrate how it is directly impacting communal well-being, both natural and human communities. So how do we define success? So the amount of technology that is scaled and the emissions that are reduced will lead the way. So with this bill, we should notice and be able to measure an increased amount of renewable energy production. Right now, we're at only 20% in total for the US. That needs to drastically increase. And we should also notice increased grid integration technology deployment. With this, we will be able to measure, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and reduce particulate matter. So we're at this really interesting point here in the US, right? And so this transition will happen. And what the point of this bill is to simply accelerate the US into a clean technology future. So coming next fall, we will look at the bill implementation, but that will be after a well-deserved break. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, I have a question. Is there a breakdown about how much of the funding will go towards sort of very nascent technologies where it's more being spent on developing them and understanding their potential, and then how much of the funding will go to sort of technologies that we understand, but, just need to be scaled up. So like a good example might be like direct to air capture is very new. We don't have a fully scalable model, like the science being worked out versus like solar, we understand it's getting cheaper. This is just about getting solar panels on people's houses and that kind of stuff.
To answer your question directly, no, the bill does not specifically state this, like the percentage breakdown. I would say two things. One, that would probably be part of the bill implementation. We can kind of debate those percentages. But secondly, there's also, the bill does create like an advisory committee. So I would also imagine that committee would be very adamant on how you allocate those funds. Yeah.
Great presentation. I was wondering, so what the investment in the renewable energy grid, considering the infrastructure bill passing yesterday, which is very recent, so I don't expect this to be really well thought out. What do you imagine? I'm just saying, no, we really saw that coming. What do you imagine the role of this bill in creating a renewable energy grid would be if this bill sets out to provide funding and assuming that the infrastructure bill provides that funding?
I would view them as complementary. Yeah. So if we can take, what's 3 trillion?
What
was it?
It was 1 trillion for the bill, yes.
1 trillion. Oh yeah. Okay. 1 trillion, and then we can toss on another 100 billion with that. I think that would, we really need as much as we can get to deploy the assets as quickly as possible.
Kind of going off of the infrastructure bill that passed, you spoke about the need to build more and update the high voltage power lines, but there's more and more debate about whether or not hyper localized like solar panels, but like community solar and sort of community localized power is actually a better way to sort of move forward with our grid in the future. Did you come across any research that spoke to that?
Yes. So it was a little complex to talk about in 10 minutes, but basically the function of needing high voltage power lines is directly correlated to battery technology and also efficiency of small power generation. So if you can increase efficiency in solar panels and increase efficiency in batteries, technically speaking, you could probably reduce your reliance on high voltage power lines. There are certain sectors of the economy, like big industry that requires a ton of power, you probably couldn't get away from, but you wouldn't necessarily need the same amount of high voltage power lines if you can increase the efficiency of other tech. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Very good. Cool.